The October wind that swept down from the Absaroka Range had a bite to it, a dry, sharp promise of the winter to come. It tasted of dust and distant pine and the vast, unending loneliness of the Montana sky. It whipped the hem of Lydia Carr's worn wool skirt against her legs as she stepped down from the stagecoach, her hand holding fast to the smaller, colder hand of her daughter. Junie, her son, Sam, followed close behind. His 11-year-old shoulders set with a man's gravity as he clutched the single carpet bag that held everything they owned in the world. The town of Silver Ford was not much more than a wide, rutted street lined with raw lumber storefronts, all of it looking temporary against the immense backdrop of the mountains. A handful of people had stopped to watch the stage arrive, their faces hardened by sun and wind, their eyes missing nothing. Tom Dawson stood with a broom in his hands outside his mercantile, his wife May a shadow in the doorway behind him. A few cowboys loitered on the saloon porch. Even the schoolteacher, Miss Nora Bell, paused on her walk home, her expression one of quiet curiosity. They were all looking, but Lydia's eyes sought only one man. He stood near the livery, talking to the blacksmith, but he had turned at the sound of the coach, Wade Callahan. Even from a distance, he was an island of stillness in the blowing dust. He was tall and broad, dressed in practical, well-made clothes that spoke of prosperity without shouting it. His face was unreadable, his posture rigid. He was, as the letter from her late husband's cousin had described him, the richest rancher in the county, a man who owned more land and cattle than anyone could count, and a man who kept to himself with a discipline that was close to religion. Lydia took a deep breath, the cold air searing her lungs. This was it, the last dollar, the last hope. She had rehearsed the words 100 times on the rattling journey, but now they felt like stones in her throat. She squeezed Junie's hand and gave Sam a small, firm nod. Dignity, she told herself. You still have that. She walked directly toward him, her worn boots making little sound in the thick dust. The townsfolk parted for her, their whispers like the rustle of dry leaves. Wade Callahan watched her approach, his gray eyes narrowing slightly. He did not move, did not offer a greeting. He simply waited, a fortress of a man. Lydia stopped a few feet from him. She could feel the heat of the forge at her back and the collective gaze of the entire town on her face. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the steady, indifferent rhythm of the wind. She looked him square in the eye, her voice clear and steady, carrying over the silence. Mr. Callahan, she said, my name is Lydia Carr. This is Sam and this is Junie. We have traveled a long way. She paused, letting the silence stretch, letting him see the exhaustion on her children's faces and the resolve on hers. Then she asked the question that had burned in her mind for the last 500 miles. Do you want a wife, or just another lonely winter? A collective gasp went through the small crowd. May Dawson's hand flew to her mouth. The cowboys on the porch stopped whittling. It was a brazen, unthinkable thing for a woman to say. A widow, no less. A stranger standing in the middle of the street with her fatherless children. Wade Callahan's face did not change, but something flickered deep in his eyes. It was not anger, not amusement. It was the shock of a direct hit, a bullet finding its mark on a man who thought himself perfectly shielded. He said nothing. He simply stared at her, at this woman who had just laid her desperation and her pride out for the entire town to see, and in doing so, had somehow turned the tables on him, making him the one who was exposed. Lydia held his gaze, refusing to be the first to look away. She had played her only card. Now all she could do was wait to see if the hand was a winning one, or if she had just made the biggest fool of herself in the whole of the Montana Territory. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Finally, without a word to her or anyone else, Wade Callahan turned on his heel and walked away, his long strides eating up the ground toward his horse. The crowd began to murmur, the shock giving way to a low hum of speculation and judgment. Lydia felt a cold dread seep into her bones. colder than the wind. She had failed. She had gambled and lost. She turned to her children, forcing a smile that felt brittle enough to shatter. "Come on," she said, her voice a little too bright. "Let's see about finding a room for the night." Inside the Callahan ranch house, the only sounds were the ticking of the grand clock in the hall and the groan of the house settling against the wind. It was a sound Wade knew well. The house was always talking, its timbers creaking and sighing like a restless old man. For 5 years, it had been his only steady companion. The house was strong, built of thick pine logs by his grandfather, a fortress against the brutal Montana winters. It had a fine kitchen, a large parlor, 4 bedrooms upstairs. It was a house built for a family, for noise and life and warmth. And it was as empty as his heart. He poured a measure of whiskey into a glass, the amber liquid catching the fading afternoon light. He stood at the window, looking out over the vast expanse of his land. The Callahan Range, it stretched as far as the eye could see, a kingdom of grass and sky. He had worked his entire life for it, bled for it, poured all of himself into it until there was nothing left for anything else, or anyone else. He thought of the woman in the street, Lydia Carr. The sheer audacity of her question still echoed in his mind. "Do you want a wife?" Or just another lonely winter she had seen him. In that one moment, in front of everyone, she had looked past the land and the money and the reputation and seen the simple, unvarnished truth of him. He was lonely. The word was a bitter pill. He was not lonely. He told himself he was self-sufficient. He was protected. He had learned his lesson about trust and commitment the hard way, a lesson taught by a woman with eyes as blue as a mountain lake and a heart as faithless as a coyote. He would not make that mistake again. But the house groaned again, a long, mournful sound, and the loneliness was a palpable thing in the room, a cold draft that the whiskey could not warm. The place was a mess. Since his last housekeeper had married a prospector and left in the spring, the dust had been winning the war. His meals were functional, his laundry piled high. He needed help. He needed someone to manage the house, to bring order to the chaos so he could focus on the ranch. Winter was coming, and winter in Montana was a battle for survival. He needed to be ready. A wife. The thought was absurd. A wife meant entanglement, emotion, vulnerability. It meant giving someone the power to hurt him again. But a housekeeper, that was different. A housekeeper was a practical arrangement. An employee, no strings, no expectations beyond a clean house and a hot meal. And her children, a boy and a girl. He had seen the way the boy, Sam, stood so straight, trying to be the man of the family. He had seen the little girl, Junie, hiding behind her mother's skirts, her eyes wide with weariness and fright. Children meant noise, messes, complications. They would disrupt the quiet, ordered world he had built around himself. They would be a constant, living reminder of the family he had once thought he wanted, before it had all turned to ash. He finished the whiskey in one swallow, the burn a welcome distraction. He was a practical man. He had a problem. That woman, Lydia Carr, she had a problem too. Perhaps their problems could solve each other. It was a risk. Bringing her here, under his roof, was a risk. But facing another winter in this big, empty, groaning house, that was starting to feel like a different kind of risk altogether. Lydia paid for a small room above the mercantile with 2 of her last 3 silver dollars. It was cramped and smelled of dust and stored flour, but it was warm. Mae Dawson had been kind, her initial shock softening into a guarded sort of pity. She had given the children a piece of licorice each and had not asked any questions Lydia did not want to answer. Now, as the sun set, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple, Junie slept soundly on the narrow cot, her small face peaceful in the dim light. Sam sat at the small window, staring out at the darkening street. She should not have said that. "Mama," he said, his voice low, "in front of everyone, Lydia sat on the edge of the bed, her body aching with a fatigue that went bone deep. Sometimes, Sam, the only way to get a man like that to listen is to make sure everyone else is listening too. But he just walked away. Yes, he did. Lydia smoothed a stray piece of hair from Junie's forehead. We will figure something out in the morning. We always do. But Sam was not comforted. He was old enough to understand the thin edge they were walking. He had seen the looks on the street, the mix of scorn and pity in people's eyes. He had been the man of the house for 2 years now, ever since Pa had been taken by the fever, and the weight of it was heavy on his young shoulders. After a while, he too fell asleep, curled at the foot of the bed. Lydia sat in the gathering dark, listening to the quiet breathing of her children. They were the only thing that mattered. For them, she would swallow her pride. For them, she would face down 100 staring towns and 1,000 lonely ranchers. She had promised her dying husband she would keep them safe, and she would. She thought of the little girl, her Junie, earlier, while Lydia had been speaking with Mrs. Dawson. Junie had wandered for a moment to the edge of the shallow creek that ran behind the store. When she came back, her tiny fist was clenched around a rock. It was a smooth, milky piece of quartz, and when she held it up to the light of the lamp, you could see a faint, shimmering brightness trapped deep inside it. A little piece of captured sunlight. Lydia had tucked it into her pocket for safekeeping. She touched it now, its smooth, cool surface a small comfort in the dark. It was a reminder that even in the hardest stone, there could be light. That even in the darkest of times, there could be hope. A firm knock on the door made her jump. Her heart leaped into her throat. It was late. Who would be calling on them now? She moved silently to the door, her hand hovering over the latch. "Who is it?" she whispered. "Wade Callahan." The voice was low. Matter of fact, it came through the wood, sending a shiver through her. She hesitated for a moment, then slid the bolt back and opened the door a crack. He stood in the narrow hallway, his large frame seeming to fill the entire space. The lamp from her room cast long shadows across his face, making it impossible to read his expression. He did not waste time on pleasantries. "I have a proposition for you, Mrs. Carr," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It is not for a wife. It is for a job." A job. The word hung in the cold air between them, plain and solid as a block of ice. Lydia felt a strange mixture of relief and insult. She had offered herself as a wife, a desperate, bold stroke. And he was countering with a position as a servant. Yet a job was what she truly needed. A job meant wages, a roof, and food for her children. It meant survival. And survival came before pride. She opened the door wider, stepping back to let him see her children sleeping peacefully, their small forms a silent testament to everything she was fighting for. "What kind of job?" she asked, her voice low so as not to wake them. "Housekeeper," he stated. "The place is a disaster. It needs a woman's hand. You will cook, clean, manage the garden, and see to the running of the house. In exchange, I will provide room and board for you and your children. And a wage, $20 a month." It was a fair offer, more than fair. But Lydia knew that accepting charity and accepting a wage were two different things. And the line between them could be perilously thin on a place as isolated as his. And the children. The boy, Sam, is old enough to work. He can learn the ranch, help with the chores. It will be good for him. The girl, she can help you, feed the chickens, stay out of the way. Lydia's chin lifted. "My daughter does not just stay out of the way. Mr. Callahan, she is a help, not a hindrance." A flicker of something, perhaps respect, showed in his eyes. "Fine, she helps. Those are the terms for room and board. The wage is for your work alone." There was one more thing, the most important thing. She had to be certain the boundaries were as clear as a fresh pane of glass. "This is a business arrangement," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "I will have my own room. My children will have theirs. There will be no other expectations. His face remained impassive, but his voice was firm. Mrs. Carr, the last thing I want in my house is expectations. You will have your own rooms at the far end of the hall. You will keep to your duties, and I will keep to mine. This is a trial. 30 days. If it works, you stay for the winter. If it does not, you will have your wages and be on your way before the first snow sticks. Is that clear? Crystal, she said. Then be ready at sunrise. I will bring the wagon. He turned and was gone, his footsteps heavy on the wooden stairs, leaving Lydia alone in the doorway with the cold draft and the sudden, dizzying reality of her new life. The Callahan Ranch was not just a piece of land. It was its own country. The wagon ride from town took the better part of 2 hours, climbing steadily into rolling grasslands that swept up to the jagged feet of the mountains. The house, when it came into view, was just as Wade Callahan had described his offer: solid, imposing, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was a 2-story log structure, built to withstand a siege, with a wide porch and windows that looked like vacant eyes. As Lydia and the children stepped down from the wagon, the house itself seemed to issue a low groan on the wind, a sound of complaint at their arrival. Wade led them inside, his boots echoing in the cavernous main room. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of sunlight piercing the grime on the windows. A thick layer of it covered every surface, from the heavy oak dining table to the stone fireplace, where the ashes of a long dead fire lay cold. The air was stale with disuse and a profound, masculine solitude. Your rooms are upstairs, to the left, he said, gesturing with his chin. The kitchen is through there. I will be at the corrals if you need anything, which you should not. And with that, he left them standing in the silent, dusty hall. For a moment, Lydia felt a wave of despair. The task ahead was monumental. But then Junie coughed, a small, delicate sound in the oppressive quiet, and Sam set down their bag with a determined thud. The despair receded, replaced by resolve. This was their home now, at least for 30 days, and Lydia Carr was not a woman to be defeated by dust. The first week was a silent negotiation of space and sound. Wade found his ordered world completely upended. He was accustomed to waking in a silent house. Now, he woke to the distant, soft sounds of a woman moving about in the kitchen downstairs, the clink of a stove lid, the scrape of a pan, the smell of coffee, rich and dark, met him before he was even halfway down the stairs. A silent invitation that felt both welcome and intrusive. He had expected noise from the children, and he was not wrong. There was the thud of running feet upstairs, quickly shushed by their mother. There was the sound of Junie humming to herself as she collected eggs from the hen house, a tune that got stuck in his head for the rest of the day. There was Sam's voice, full of questions for the ranch hands, eager and bright. Wade found it all profoundly irritating. The silence had been his armor for so long, and now it was full of holes. Yet he could not deny the changes. The house began to breathe again. The dust vanished, replaced by the scent of beeswax and lemon. The windows were cleaned, and the grand room was flooded with the golden light of the Montana autumn. His meals were no longer solitary, functional affairs. He would come in from the cold to find a hot stew simmering on the stove, fresh bread cooling on the counter. They ate at the big oak table, the 3 of them at one end, and he alone at the other. The length of the table a stark representation of the distance he insisted on maintaining. He would listen to Lydia talk to her children, her voice a low, steady murmur, asking Sam about his day, correcting Junie's manners. She never spoke to him unless it was about household matters, a need for more flour, a question about the root cellar, and when she did, she looked at him with those clear, direct eyes that seemed to see right through his defenses, acknowledging his loneliness without ever speaking of it. It was unnerving. He felt seen in a way he had not allowed himself to be in years, and it made the foundations of his solitary world feel dangerously unsteady. A week after their arrival, Lydia took the buckboard into Silver Ford for supplies. The town was a necessary evil, a place of staring eyes and whispered judgments. She could feel them as she tied the horses in front of the Dawsons' mercantile. The way conversations paused, the way women huddled together, their gazes following her. The widow from the Callahan place. The gossip had had a full week to ferment. Inside, May Dawson was polite but distant. As Lydia gave her list to Tom, the mercantile door opened, and a different kind of presence filled the store. Silas Dryden was a man who took up space, not just with his large, well-fed frame, but with an aura of importance that demanded attention. He was dressed in a tailored suit that was out of place in the dusty town, his face florid and his smile oily. He was the man who was bringing the railroad, the man who owned the water rights, the man everyone knew was accumulating power with a relentless, single-minded focus. His eyes landed on Lydia, and his smile widened. "Mrs. Carr," he said, his voice smooth as poured molasses. "I had heard a rumor you had graced our little community. It seems you have landed on your feet quite comfortably." Lydia inclined her head, offering nothing more than a cool nod. "Mr. Dryden." She turned back to the counter, but he moved to stand beside her, blocking her in. The scent of his bay rum cologne was cloying. "The Callahan Range is a fine place," he said, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "But it is a place of the past. Wade Callahan is a man stuck in his grandfather's time. The future, Mrs. Carr, is about progress. It is about steam and steel and water. The man who controls the water controls the valley." Lydia's hand tightened on her reticule. She knew enough about ranching to understand the truth in his words. "I am merely a housekeeper, Mr. Dryden," she said. "Such matters are not my concern." "Oh, but they should be," he purred. "A woman like you. A woman of spirit. With 2 young children to think of. You should be aligning yourself with the future, not the past. A beautiful widow does not have to settle for being a servant. She could have a protector, a partner, a man who can offer her a permanent and prosperous place in the new world that is coming." His meaning was unmistakable. It was a proposition, wrapped in a threat. He was offering her a place at his side, and implying that the alternative, staying with Wade, was a losing bet. The air crackled with his audacity. Tom Dawson suddenly found a barrel of nails that needed his immediate attention, and May began rearranging a stack of calico bolts with frantic energy. Lydia turned to face him fully. Her heart was pounding, but her voice was cold as a mountain stream. "Mr. Dryden," she said, her words ringing out in the suddenly quiet store, "I am not for sale, and I am not looking for a protector. I came here for flour and beans, not for an insulting offer from a man who smells of cheap cologne and cheaper ambition. Now, if you will excuse me, you are standing in my light." For a heartbeat, Silas Dryden's charming facade dropped. His eyes went hard and cold, and a flush of angry red crept up his neck. He had been publicly dismissed, his power and charm rendered meaningless by a penniless widow. He stared at her for a long moment, his fury a palpable force, before composing himself with a tight, unpleasant smile. "You will regret that, Mrs. Carr," he whispered, then turned and strode out of the store. The silence he left behind was thick with tension. May Dawson finally looked at Lydia, her expression a mixture of fear and awe. "That was a dangerous man to cross," she said quietly. Lydia's legs felt weak, but she stood tall. "Some things are worth the risk, Mrs. Dawson." As she loaded her supplies into the buckboard, she saw the schoolteacher, Nora Bell. Across the street, Miss Bell had clearly witnessed the exchange through the store's large front window. Instead of turning away or joining the whisperers, she gave Lydia a small, deliberate nod of approval, a gesture of solidarity that felt like a warm hand on her shoulder. It was a small thing, but it was enough. In a town that seemed determined to judge her, Lydia had found one person who saw her not as a scandal, but as a woman of strength. It was a start. The days on the Callahan Range fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the ever-present threat of winter. It was a rhythm of hard work, a language spoken not in words, but in the slam of a screen door at dawn, the steady chop of an axe splitting firewood, and the weary scrape of boots on the porch at dusk. Lydia found a fierce satisfaction in taming the chaos of the ranch house kitchen. She scrubbed the years of grime from the pine floorboards, organized the pantry with a general's precision, and brought the hulking wood stove to a state of gleaming obedience. She was not merely cleaning, she was preparing for a siege. She inventoried every sack of flour, every jar of preserves, calculating how to stretch their resources through the long, frozen months ahead. This was her domain, a kingdom of sustenance and thrift, and in it, she was no one's servant. She was a provider, earning her family's safety with the skill of her own two hands. Outside, in the crisp, cold air, her son was undergoing a transformation of his own. Wade Callahan had taken Sam under his wing, not with warmth or paternal affection, but with the same exacting discipline he applied to everything on his ranch. He began by teaching the boy about respect for the tools that could give life, or take it away. One afternoon, he took an old Winchester rifle down from the rack above the fireplace. Lydia watched from the kitchen window, her heart a tight knot of apprehension. Wade led Sam to a clearing behind the barn. Well away from the house and livestock, he spent a long time showing him how to hold the rifle, how to check if it was loaded, how to aim, and most importantly, where never to point it. His voice was a low, steady rumble, carrying on the wind. He was not just teaching Sam to shoot. He was teaching him to be careful, to be responsible, to understand the weight of his actions. When the first shot finally rang out, loud and sharp in the vast silence, Lydia saw Sam stumble back, his shoulders smarting, but Wade was there, a firm hand on the boy's back, steadying him, showing him how to brace himself for the next one. A quiet pride swelled in her chest, a painful, complicated emotion. This was something she could not give her son, a father's lesson, delivered by a man who wanted nothing to do with being a father. The work was relentless. Sam learned to mend fence lines alongside Wade, his small hands struggling with the wire stretchers, his face set with determination. They worked on the frost-proofing for the root cellar, banking earth high against the stone walls to protect the precious cache of potatoes and carrots from the deep freeze to come. In the smokehouse, the air grew thick and fragrant with the scent of curing hams and bacon, a rich promise of protein for the winter table. Sam was quiet at dinner now, his body tired from a man's labor, but his eyes were bright. He watched Wade Callahan with an open, uncomplicated hero worship that made Wade deeply uncomfortable and Lydia profoundly grateful. Lydia's fear of becoming indebted began to shift. She was not receiving a handout. She was holding up her end of a vital partnership. She managed the house, the garden, the food, and the children. Freeing Wade to manage the ranch, it was an unspoken contract of survival, and every jar of tomatoes she canned, every sock she mended, was her signature on the dotted line. Still, she held a part of herself back, a careful distance she maintained to protect her heart from the dangerous illusion that this was anything more than a temporary arrangement. The sky turned on them one afternoon with a sudden, violent temper of the high country. One moment, the sun was shining in a pale, watery sky. The next, the world went dark. A low, ominous rumble grew into a roar, not of thunder, but of something far more destructive. Hail. Wade was halfway across the yard when the first stones hit, the size of marbles, hitting the dusty ground with sharp, percussive cracks. "Come on," he yelled, his voice barely audible over the growing din. Inside, Lydia herded the children into the house just as the deluge began. The hail hammered against the log walls and the tin roof, a deafening, relentless assault. It was like being inside a drum being beaten by a giant. Junie began to cry, her small hands pressed over her ears. Through the window, they saw the roof of the chicken coop, a flimsy structure at the best of times, begin to sag under the weight of the ice. Then, With a splintering crack, a section of it collapsed. The chickens, squawking in terror, burst out into the storm. "We are going to lose them all," Lydia said, her face pale. Wade was already pulling on his heavy canvas coat. "Stay here," he commanded. "No," Lydia said, her jaw set. "Sam, get the grain sacks from the pantry. Junie, you stay here and be a brave girl for Mama." She pulled on her own thin shawl, a useless gesture against the icy onslaught. "We are not losing our winter eggs." For a second, Wade looked like he would argue, but he saw the same iron will in her eyes that he had seen in the street in Silver Ford. He gave a curt nod. What followed was a frantic, chaotic battle against the elements. The hailstones were the size of eggs now, striking with bruising force. Wade and Lydia ran into the white, churning fury, using the empty grain sacks as makeshift shields. Sam was right behind them. They worked without speaking, a desperate, synchronized team. Wade would lunge and grab a panicked hen, handing it off to Lydia, who would tuck it into a sack held by Sam. They were soaked to the bone in seconds, the icy water plastering their clothes to their skin. The ground was a treacherous carpet of bouncing ice. Lydia slipped, her feet going out from under her, before she hit the ground. Wade's arm was around her waist, strong and sure, pulling her upright. Their faces were inches apart, the roar of the storm surrounding them, their breath mingling in a white cloud. The world seemed to stop for an instant, the frantic work and the cold and the fear all fading away, leaving only the startling intimacy of his touch. Then the moment was gone. He released her and turned back to the task, his expression unreadable. They managed to round up most of the chickens, herding them into the relative safety of the barn. They were battered, cold, and exhausted, but they had done it. As the storm finally rumbled away, leaving a strange, bruised light in its wake, they stood in the barn doorway, looking at the wreckage of the coop and the white blanket of ice covering the world. The house, solid and unyielding, let out a long, deep groan as a gust of wind hit it, the sound not of complaint, but of steadfast endurance. "You are a stubborn woman, Mrs. Carr," Wade said, his voice rough. He was not looking at her, but at the house. "It seems to be a necessary trait in this country, Mr. Callahan," she replied, shivering. That night, Wade watched them from his end of the long table. He watched Sam, so tired he could barely eat, recounting their adventure in a proud whisper to his sister. He watched Junie, her earlier fear gone, listening with wide, adoring eyes. And he watched Lydia, her movements stiff from the cold and the bruises that would surely follow, but her face calm and composed. The three of them were a unit, a small, tight circle of warmth in his cold, empty house. He felt the pull of it, the dangerous, seductive lure of belonging, and it terrified him. This was how it started, a shared crisis, a moment of connection. It felt too much like family. It felt permanent, and Wade Callahan did not believe in permanent. A few evenings later, an uneasy quiet had settled back over the house. The memory of the storm still lingered in the air. They sat in the kitchen, the heart of the house, where the warmth from the stove pushed back the evening chill. Sam was trying to whittle a piece of wood, his brow furrowed in concentration. Lydia was mending a tear in Junie's dress. Wade was cleaning the Winchester, the methodical, repetitive motion of familiar comfort. "Winter is going to be hard, is it not?" Sam asked suddenly, looking up at Wade. His voice was small. Wade finished wiping down the barrel before he answered. "It always is." "My grandpa," he said, his voice quiet, almost reluctant, as if he were sharing a secret against his will. He used to tell a story about the winter of '71. The snow was so deep it buried the fences. They ran out of food. For a week, all they had to eat was soup. Junie's eyes grew wide. "What kind of soup?" Wade hesitated. Then a ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Pine bark soup," he said. Sam's face scrunched up in disgust. Pine bark. That is what he said. Boiled it till it was soft. Said it tasted like turpentine and regret, but it kept them alive. The image was so stark, so absurd, that Junie let out a little giggle. Sam tried to stifle his own laugh, but it burst out of him, a full, genuine peal of laughter that filled the warm kitchen. Even Lydia smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and momentarily erased the lines of worry from her face. The sound of their laughter was alien in that house, a bright, foreign music. It startled Wade, and for a moment, he felt the ice around his own heart crack, just a little. The kitchen, with the smell of baking bread and the sound of children's laughter, felt, for the first time, like the heart of a home. The feeling was gone as quickly as it came. The next day, riding the northern fence line near Willow Creek, Wade saw him, a lone rider on a ridge, silhouetted against the gray sky. Watching the ranch, it was Silas Dryden. He was too far away to make out his features, but Wade knew the set of the man's shoulders, the expensive horse. Dryden was watching his water. He sat there for a long time before turning and riding away. A cold knot formed in Wade's stomach. His unease was confirmed a few days later in town. He was loading sacks of feed when Deputy Finch walked by, his eyes darting everywhere but at Wade. "Morning, Finch," Wade said. "Callahan." The deputy nodded, but did not stop. He took a few more steps, then paused as if reconsidering. "You should watch your back," he said, his voice low, not turning around. "A man like Dryden has a long reach. The sheriff listens when he talks. He has a lot of markers to call in." Then he was gone, leaving Wade standing in the cold, with the weight of the feed sacks feeling suddenly much heavier, and the clear, unspoken warning that the next storm to hit the Callahan Range would not be from the sky. The uneasy peace that settled over the ranch was as fragile as a skim of ice on a water trough. The unspoken threat from Silas Dryden was a constant presence, a shadow on the edge of their lives. But the daily demands of survival were more immediate. The last of the autumn sun bathed the valley in a soft, hazy light, a final, beautiful deception before the monochrome hardship of winter. It was during this deceptive calm that disaster struck, not from the hand of a greedy man, but from the innocent exploration of a child. Junie had a child's fascination with bright colors. While Lydia was in the root cellar and Sam was helping Wade mend a harness, Junie wandered along the banks of Willow Creek. There, nestled amongst the fading green leaves of a low bush, were clusters of brilliant scarlet berries. They looked just like the sweet, tart currants she used to pick with her mother in the small garden they had left behind. They were a piece of home in this vast, new world. Carefully, she plucked a handful, their glossy skins cool against her palm, and ate them one by one. The sickness came on after dinner. It began with a stomach ache, which Lydia initially dismissed as a result of too much molasses cake. She put Junie to bed with a warm cloth on her belly and a kiss on her forehead. But an hour later, a sharp, frightened cry echoed from the children's room. Lydia rushed in to find Junie feverish, her small body slick with a cold sweat. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. As Lydia held her, the girl's body was racked with violent shivers, and she began to speak nonsense, her eyes wide and unfocused, seeing things that were not there. Lydia's blood ran cold. She knew, with a mother's sickening certainty, that this was no simple ailment. Sam, woken by the commotion, stood in the doorway, his face a pale mask of fear. "What was she doing today?" Lydia asked, her voice sharp with panic. "Where did she go?" Sam thought for a moment, his brow furrowed. "She was down by the creek," he said. When she came back, her lips were all red. The berries. Lydia's stomach twisted into a knot of pure terror. She had warned the children never to eat anything from the wild without asking her first. But Junie was only 7, and the lure of the familiar had been too strong. She gathered her daughter into her arms, wrapped her in a thick quilt, and carried her downstairs. Wade was in the main room, going over his ledgers by the light of a lantern. He looked up as she entered, his face impassive, but when he saw the child in her arms, the raw fear in Lydia's eyes, he was on his feet in an instant. "She is burning up," Lydia said, her voice trembling, threatening to break. "She ate something, some kind of wild berries from the creek. I do not know what to do." Her composure, the proud, self-sufficient armor she wore every day, had crumbled to dust. She was just a mother, terrified of losing her child. Wade did not ask questions. He did not hesitate. He moved to the fireplace and touched Junie's forehead with the back of his rough hand. His touch was surprisingly gentle. His face hardened with a resolve that cut through Lydia's panic like a knife. "I am going for the doctor," he said. His voice was calm, a steady rock in her sea of fear. "Keep her warm. Try to get some water into her if you can." He was already pulling on his heavy coat and boots, moving with an economy of motion that wasted no time. He grabbed his hat from the peg by the door. "It is a 2-hour ride," Lydia whispered, the enormity of the distance and the darkness hitting her. He just looked at her, his gray eyes clear and direct in the lamplight. "I will be faster." He was gone before she could say another word. The sound of his running footsteps on the porch followed by the urgent thunder of his horse's hooves galloping into the black, moonless night. The hours that followed were the longest of Lydia's life. She sat in the big armchair by the fire, holding Junie, murmuring to her, trying to soothe the delirious child. Sam stayed with her, a silent, stalwart companion. He kept the fire fed, his small face illuminated by the flickering flames, his expression grim and adult. He would periodically bring his mother a cup of water, his touch on her arm a small, comforting pressure. They were alone in the vast, groaning house, a tiny island of warmth and fear in an ocean of darkness. Lydia prayed. She prayed to a God she had not spoken to since her husband's death, making desperate bargains, promising anything in exchange for her daughter's life. The ride to Silver Ford was a brutal, headlong plunge through the dark. Wade pushed his horse, a powerful buckskin named Thunder, harder than he ever had before. He knew every dip and rise of the land, every treacherous patch of rock and gopher hole. But in the pitch black, it was a deadly gamble. The cold wind tore at him, stinging his eyes and freezing his breath. He did not feel it. All he could see was the image of Junie's small, flushed face and the look of utter devastation in Lydia's eyes. He told himself he was doing it for the ranch. A sick child meant a distracted housekeeper, and with winter closing in, he could not afford distractions. It was a flimsy lie, and he knew it. He was riding like a madman, not for his ranch, but for a little girl who hummed while she collected eggs, and for a woman whose quiet strength had begun to fill the empty spaces in his house and in his life. He was not just fetching a doctor. He was fighting back against the cruel, indifferent hand of fate that had already taken so much from her. He reached Silver Ford in just over an hour and a half, his horse lathered and trembling. He did not slow down. Galloping right down the main street to the small house with the neat white fence where Dr. Whitlow lived, he pounded on the door until a light appeared in the window, and the grizzled, sleep-rumpled doctor opened it, a shotgun in his hands. When the doctor saw who it was, and the state of the horse, he lowered the gun. "Callahan, what in God's name is it?" "It is the girl," Wade said, his words coming out in ragged gasps. "The Carr girl. She is sick, poisoned." The doctor was already pulling on his boots. Back at the ranch, just as Lydia felt the last of her hope begin to fray, she heard it, the distant but unmistakable sound of hoofbeats. 2 horses this time, coming fast. Sam ran to the window. "It is him. Mama, he is back." The relief was so powerful, it almost brought Lydia to her knees. A few minutes later, Wade and Dr. Whitlow burst through the door, bringing a swirl of cold night air with them. The doctor, a man of calm competence, went straight to work, his gentle hands examining Junie, his questions for Lydia quiet and direct. He identified the berries from her description. Nightshade. He called them a pretty poison. He administered a foul-smelling emetic from his bag, and then a series of tinctures to calm the fever and counteract the toxin. And then there was nothing to do but wait. Wade did not leave. He stood by the fireplace, his face streaked with dirt, his body rigid with exhaustion, his eyes never leaving the small, still form in the chair. He had done all he could do, and now he was helpless, a feeling he despised. Toward dawn, the fever broke. Junie's breathing eased, and she fell into a deep, natural sleep, her skin cool to the touch for the first time in hours. She will be weak for a few days, but she will be fine, Dr. Whitlow said, packing his bag. You are lucky, Mrs. Carr, and you, Callahan, he added, looking at Wade. You rode like the devil himself was on your tail. After the doctor left, a new kind of silence filled the room. It was not the silence of fear, but of profound, bone-weary relief. Sam, who had been a stoic little man all night, finally walked over to Wade, who was now slumped in a chair. The boy looked at the exhausted rancher, at the mud and sweat that covered him, and his young face was filled with a reverence that went beyond mere admiration. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He hesitated for a second, and then the words slipped out, half a question, half a statement, a boy's deepest wish made real. Thank you, Pa. The word struck Wade with the force of a physical blow. He froze, his hands clenching on the arms of the chair. It was a name he had never expected to hear, a title he had never wanted. He did not know how to respond. He just gave a short, jerky nod and looked away, into the fire, his face a mask of confusion and a strange, unfamiliar pain. News of the night ride spread through the valley. Dr. Whitlow, a man who appreciated courage, was not shy about telling the story at Dawson's Mercantile. He told it to Bill Hart and Pete Sawyer, two ranchers from neighboring spreads who had come in for supplies. They were hard, practical men who understood the land and the risks it demanded. They had been watching Wade Callahan and his new arrangement with a cautious curiosity, and they had been watching Silas Dryden with a growing distrust. Rode through the night, did he? Bill Hart said, stroking his beard. For the housekeeper's kid. That is a hell of a thing, Pete Sawyer added. They exchanged a look that said more than words. A man's actions defined him out here, and Wade Callahan's actions spoke of a loyalty that went beyond a simple wage. A few days later, Bill Hart rode over to the Callahan range on the pretext of looking at a bull. Before he left, he paused, his hand on his saddle horn. Heard your man Dryden has been sniffing around the creek, he said to Wade. You watch yourself. Some of us still believe a man's water is his own. If you need an extra pair of eyes, you let me know. It was a quiet declaration of allegiance, the first brick in a wall of community support. Lydia, in her gratitude, found her own way to build bridges. Her garden had produced a surplus, more than her small family and Wade could possibly eat. She spent 2 days in the kitchen, canning and preserving, filling dozens of jars with squash, beans, and spiced apples. She loaded a large crate into the buckboard and drove it to the schoolhouse, a gift for Nora Bell to distribute to any families who might be struggling as winter approached. Nora accepted with tears in her eyes. Mae Dawson saw the delivery and told her husband. The story passed from one woman to another. The narrative about the proud, brazen widow who had trapped the rich rancher began to change. People saw her now not as an opportunist, but as a hard-working mother, a generous neighbor. The tide of public opinion, so quick to condemn, was slowly beginning to turn. As she watched Junie slowly regain her strength and saw Sam trail after Wade with a new sense of purpose, Lydia felt a profound shift within herself. The gnawing emptiness that had been her constant companion since her husband's death was beginning to recede. She was needed here. Her work, her care, her very presence mattered. This was not the life she had planned, but it was a life, full and demanding and real. In caring for this fractured makeshift family, she was, to her own surprise, healing herself. The first hard frost had silvered the land, a beautiful, brittle warning that the season of grace was over. The cold was now a constant, seeping through the chinks in the log walls and demanding a perpetual fire in the hearth. They had fallen into a fragile domestic rhythm. The four of them. A rhythm broken only by the ever-present tension of what Silas Dryden might do next. The attack, when it came, was not with lawyers or threats, but with the primal, terrifying weapon of fire. It was Sam who saw it first. He had gotten up in the middle of the night and, looking out his window toward the east pasture, saw a strange, flickering orange light against the profound blackness of the hills. It was a hungry light, a greedy light, and it was growing. "Pa!" The word was a shout, a panicked cry that tore through the sleeping house. It was not directed at Wade, not consciously, but it was his name the boy called in a moment of terror. Fire. Wade was out of his bed before the sound had fully registered, pulling on his boots and trousers with the swift, instinctual movements of a man who had lived his life responding to emergencies. He met Lydia in the hallway. She was tying her robe, her face a pale oval in the dark. "The east pasture," he said, his voice a low, hard growl. "The winter hay." The words hung in the air. A death sentence for their hopes of surviving the winter. That hay was their lifeblood, the fuel that would keep the cattle alive through the months of snow when there was no grass to be found. Losing it meant losing everything. He grabbed a rifle from the rack. "Stay in the house. Lock the door." Lydia's eyes flashed in the dim light. "The hell I will," she said, her voice fierce and low. "That is my family's food you stacked out there, too. Sam, get the buckets from the porch. We are all going." Wade looked at her, at the small, determined woman and the boy who was already moving to obey her, and he did not waste breath arguing. He saw the same unyielding spirit that had faced him down in the street, the same grit that had fought the hailstorm. He gave a single sharp nod. The scene at the east pasture was a vision from hell. The massive hayrick, the product of a summer's hard labor, was a roaring inferno, a mountain of flame that threw a demonic, dancing light across the landscape and sent a column of thick, black smoke boiling into the starry sky. The heat was a physical blow, pushing them back, scorching their faces. The sound was a deafening roar, punctuated by the sharp crackle of burning grass. It smelled of destruction. "Get a line from the creek," Wade yelled over the noise, his voice raw. "Sam, you and your mother, fill anything that will hold water." For the next hour, they fought the blaze with a desperate, frantic energy. It was a hopeless battle against a monster, but they fought it anyway. Wade, using a wet blanket, beat at the edges of the fire, trying to keep it from spreading to the dry pasture grass. Lydia and Sam worked in a tireless, heartbreaking rhythm, running to the creek, filling the heavy wooden buckets, and hauling them back, their small offerings of water turning to steam with a contemptuous hiss the moment they hit the flames. They were not alone for long. A light appeared on the track from the west, then another, Bill Hart and Pete Sawyer, alerted by the terrible glow in the sky, had come riding hard. They brought their ranch hands, a half-dozen grim-faced men who immediately joined the bucket line without a word. The fight became more organized, more focused. A line of men now stretched from the creek to the fire, passing buckets hand over hand. Lydia, seeing the men had the water line handled, took on the task of tending to the fighters. She ran back and forth, bringing them wet cloths for their faces, shouting words of encouragement, her presence a steady, driving force in the chaos. They fought until their muscles screamed and their lungs burned with smoke. They fought until the roar of the fire began to diminish, until the mountain of flame was reduced to a vast, smoldering heap of black ash and glowing red embers. As the first pale gray light of dawn broke over the mountains, they finally stood back, exhausted, filthy, and victorious. They had lost nearly a quarter of the hay, A devastating blow. But they had saved the rest. They had saved their winter. In the midst of the fight, a burning timber had rolled from the top of the stack. Lydia, pushing Sam out of the way, had thrown up her arm to shield her face. A shower of hot embers had rained down on her, and one had landed on the back of her hand, searing her skin. She had cried out, a sharp intake of breath, but had brushed it away and kept working, the pain a distant thing compared to the urgency of the moment. Now, in the quiet, smoky aftermath, the pain returned with a vengeance, a sharp, throbbing burn. She looked down at her hand. A nasty, red welt was already beginning to blister. She tried to hide it, but Wade saw. His eyes, rimmed with soot and exhaustion, missed nothing. "Come back to the house," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but it was a command. In the quiet of the kitchen, the air still thick with the lingering smell of smoke on their clothes, he made her sit. He washed the burn gently with cool water from the pump, his large, calloused hands surprisingly careful. He found a tin of medicinal salve in a cupboard and opened it. "This will sting," he said. She nodded, bracing herself. He dipped his fingers into the salve and began to apply it to the burn. His touch was feather-light, but it sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with the pain. It was the first time he had touched her with anything approaching tenderness. His thumb brushed against her palm. A slow, deliberate stroke. And the world seemed to narrow to that single point of contact. The chaos of the fire, the fear, the exhaustion. It all faded away. There was only the quiet of the kitchen, the smell of the salve, and the startling, intimate pressure of his hand on hers. She looked up at him. His face was inches from hers, his expression unreadable in the gray morning light. He was looking at their joined hands, a strange intensity in his gaze. He was a man who had built walls of stone around himself, and she could feel them trembling. The air between them grew thick and heavy with unspoken things, with the shared danger and the quiet understanding that had grown in the spaces between them. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then, as if realizing how close he was to a ledge he had sworn never to approach, he abruptly finished his work and stood up, breaking the spell. "Keep it clean," he said, his voice gruff again. "The walls back in place." He turned and left the kitchen, leaving her alone with her throbbing hand and a heart that was beating far too fast. 2 days later, the second attack came. A rider from town, a boy who worked for the town's only lawyer, delivered a long, official-looking envelope. Wade took it, his face grim. He read the letter standing on the porch, the afternoon sun casting long shadows at his feet. As he read, his jaw tightened, and the muscle in his cheek began to twitch. Without a word, he handed the letter to Lydia. Her hands trembled slightly as she read. It was dense with legal language, but the meaning was brutally clear. Silas Dryden, through his lawyer, was formally challenging Wade Callahan's claim to the water rights for Willow Creek, citing a discrepancy in the original territorial survey from 30 years prior. It was a technicality, a legal loophole that Dryden's money and influence had clearly unearthed. Willow Creek was the main source of water for the Callahan Range. Without it, the ranch would wither and die. The fire had been a direct assault. This was a flanking maneuver, an attempt to cut their throat with a pen instead of a torch. They stood together on the porch, the letter a declaration of war in Lydia's hand. The 30-day trial period was nearly over. Winter was coming, and an enemy was at their gate. An enemy who was trying to burn them out and litigate them into dust. The first snow came a week after the letter. Not a gentle dusting, but a sudden, violent blizzard that descended from the mountains with a howling fury. The world beyond the windows dissolved into a churning vortex of white. The temperature plummeted. The wind shrieked around the corners of the house, which groaned and creaked in response, its old timbers complaining but holding firm. "The herd," Wade said, his face etched with worry as he stared out the window. "They will drift with the wind," Get lost in the gullies and freeze. We have to keep them pushed up against the bluffs." He began pulling on his heaviest gear. Lydia watched him, her heart sinking. He could not go out in that alone. It was a suicide mission. "I am coming with you," she said. "It is no place for a woman." She met his gaze, her own unflinching. "It is no place for any soul to be alone. Sam is old enough to keep the fire going and look after Junie. You need another pair of hands." He saw that arguing was useless. He simply nodded and handed her a heavy oilskin coat that smelled of him, of leather and wood smoke. The world outside the house was a nightmare of wind and blinding snow. They fought their way to the barn, the wind a solid wall pushing against them. On horseback. Visibility was less than 20 feet. They found the herd already beginning to scatter, their dark shapes ghostly apparitions in the swirling white. For hours, they rode the edges of the herd, their shouts lost in the roar of the storm, turning the cattle, pushing them toward the relative shelter of a long, high bluff. It was brutal, exhausting work. The cold was a physical pain, seeping deep into their bones. Finally, they had the herd bunched together, huddling for warmth in the lee of the rock face. They dismounted, finding a small alcove in the rock that offered some small protection from the wind. They stood close together, their shoulders touching, sharing the warmth of their bodies against the onslaught of the storm. They were two small, fragile figures in a vast, indifferent tempest. Lydia was shivering, not just from the cold, but from exhaustion and the stark reality of their situation. Everything they had, everything they were fighting for, was so precarious, so easily swept away by fire or wind or the stroke of a lawyer's pen. In the roar of the blizzard, a strange clarity came to her. She turned her head, her face close to his, her words nearly snatched away by the wind. "In town, that first day," she said, her voice a raw whisper. "I told your money and your name. No, it was all I knew of you. A rich man, a name." He looked down at her, his face barely visible in the white gloom, his eyes dark and questioning. "But out here," she continued, her voice gaining a strength that came from a deep, certain place inside her. "This work, this roof, these children laughing. My whole body keeps saying yes to a life with you." It was not a plea, it was not a proposition. It was a simple, unadorned statement of fact, a truth laid bare in the heart of the storm. Wade stood utterly still, the howling wind the only sound for a long moment. He looked at her, at the strength in her tired face, and he understood. She was not talking about romance. She was talking about partnership. She was talking about facing the fire and the storms and the Silas Drydens of the world. Together. He reached out, his gloved hand coming up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a snowflake that had landed on her eyelash. His touch was a promise. "I will protect this," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before. He did not say, "I will protect you." He said, "I will protect this life, this us." It was the most profound vow he could make. He leaned in, his cold lips finding hers, and in the heart of the howling blizzard, there was a moment of absolute stillness, of profound warmth. The world outside, with its storms and its threats, faded to nothing, leaving only the two of them. A silent promise made, a life chosen. The swirling snow closed in around them, shrouding them in a curtain of white, a quiet, private world of their own making. The blizzard broke as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world transformed. The valley was buried under a thick blanket of pristine white snow, the silence so deep it seemed to have a weight of its own. The sun, when it finally appeared, was a pale, cold disk in a brilliant blue sky, and the light it cast on the snow was dazzling, almost painful to the eyes. Inside the Callahan ranch house, the storm had changed the landscape as well. The invisible walls Wade had so carefully maintained had been breached, and a new, unspoken understanding flowed between him and Lydia. There was a quiet intimacy in their shared glances, a comfortable rhythm to their movements in the small spaces of the house. It was not a whirlwind romance, but something deeper, quieter, and far more solid. A foundation laid by shared hardship and mutual respect. The legal threat from Silas Dryden, however, had not been buried by the snow. It remained, a poison seeping into the new peace they had found. A week after the storm, Wade knew they could not put it off any longer. They had to go to town, to see the lawyer and begin to formulate a defense against Dryden's claim. They rode in the sleigh, the runners gliding silently over the packed snow. Sam and Junie were bundled in the back, their faces rosy with the cold, their laughter puffing out in white clouds. Wade and Lydia sat in the front, the warmth of their bodies a small comfort against the biting air. They looked, for all the world, like a family. The thought occurred to Wade with a jolt that was both terrifying and strangely welcome. Silverford was a different town under its mantle of snow. The harsh lines of the buildings were softened, the rutted streets smoothed over, but the atmosphere was as tense as a coiled spring. As Wade tied the horses in front of the lawyer's office, he saw Silas Dryden emerge from the saloon across the street. Dryden was not a man built for snow. He moved with a clumsy, bullish gait, his expensive suit looking ridiculous in the rustic, winter-bound town. He saw them, and a slow, malicious smile spread across his face. He changed his course, heading directly for them. Bill Hart and a few other ranchers were standing on the porch of the Mercantile, and they stopped talking, their eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. "Callahan," Dryden said, his voice carrying in the still, cold air, "and Mrs. Carr, taking the whole brood out for a ride. Playing house must be a pleasant distraction from watching your legacy crumble into dust." Wade's hands, which had been unhitching the horses, went still. He turned slowly, his body a study in controlled anger. "That is my business." "Dryden." "Is it?" Dryden chuckled. "A wet, unpleasant sound. It seems to me my lawyer is making it his business. And yours, Mrs. Carr," he said, his eyes lingering on Lydia with an insulting familiarity. "You chose the wrong horse to back, when this ranch is mine, and it will be mine. Perhaps you will be more amenable to a new housekeeping position. A man of my stature has needs." Lydia's chin went up, her eyes flashing with cold fire. But before she could speak, Dryden took a step closer, his gaze dropping to Sam and Junie, who were now standing by the sleigh, their eyes wide. "And the children," he mused, tapping a finger against his lips. "One must wonder about their future. A boy raised on a failing ranch, a girl with no name to speak of. It is a hard world for little bastards." That was the line. The quiet, disciplined control that had defined Wade Callahan for years shattered like a pane of ice. He moved so fast it was a blur. One long stride closed the distance between them, and his fist, a hard, heavy knot of bone and muscle, connected with Silas Dryden's jaw with a sickening crack. Dryden went down like a felled ox, his bulk hitting the snow-packed street with a heavy thud. He lay there for a moment, stunned, a trickle of blood running from the corner of his mouth into the clean white snow. The entire street had gone silent. The ranchers on the porch were frozen in place. Tom Dawson stood in the doorway of his store, a sack of flour forgotten in his hands. Wade stood over Dryden, his chest heaving, his hands still clenched into fists. He had not said a word, but his action had been a deafening declaration of war. He looked at the man on the ground, then lifted his gaze and swept it across the faces of the watching townsfolk. "You will not speak to her that way," he said, his voice low and shaking with a fury that was more intimidating than any shout. "And you will never speak of these children again. This is my family. You come after them. You come through me." He turned his back on Dryden, a gesture of ultimate contempt, and walked to where Lydia and the children stood. He put a protective arm around Lydia's shoulders, his touch firm and possessive. Sam stared at Wade, his young face a mixture of shock and profound adoration. A slow clapping started from the porch of the Mercantile. It was Bill Hart. Pete Sawyer joined in, and then the other ranchers. It was not a loud applause, but a steady, rhythmic beat of approval. Tom Dawson nodded his head, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. The community, which had once watched Lydia with suspicion, had just chosen its side. They had seen a man defend his family, and in the simple, brutal code of the West, there was no higher law. That night, a meeting was held in the Callahan's big main room. Bill Hart and Pete Sawyer had come, along with 3 other ranchers from the valley. They sat around the big oak table, the air thick with the smell of coffee and the serious business of men protecting their way of life. "He burned your hay, Wade," Bill Hart said, his voice a low rumble. "He is coming after your water. He will not stop with you. If he can steal your rights with a crooked lawyer, he can steal any of ours." "We have to stand together," Pete Sawyer added. "The law in this town belongs to him right now, so we have to be our own law." An idea began to form, a simple, practical strategy born of necessity. They would form a watch. Every hayrick in the valley, from the Callahan Range to the Sawyer Spread, was a target. They were all vulnerable, but together, they could be strong. They spent the next hour working out a schedule, drawing a rough map of the valley on a piece of paper. Each ranch would provide men for a rotating nightly patrol. They would ride the fence lines in pairs, armed and alert. A network of vigilant eyes watching over the valley's collective future. It was more than a patrol. It was a declaration of independence, a quiet rebellion of hard-working men against the tyranny of one man's greed. The valley was taking back its self-respect. 2 nights later, as Wade was preparing to take his turn on the patrol, a lone rider approached the ranch. It was late, the moon a sliver in the icy sky. Wade met the rider in the yard, his rifle held loosely in his hand. He was surprised to see it was Deputy Finch. The deputy looked nervous, his eyes darting toward the dark shadows of the barn. He dismounted, his movements furtive. "I cannot stay long, Callahan," he said, his voice a low whisper. "What do you want?" Finch Wade's voice was hard. He had little respect for a man he saw as Dryden's puppet. Finch reached inside his coat and pulled out a thin leather ledger. He held it out to Wade. "My conscience is a damn noisy thing," he said. "I cannot sleep nights. I became a lawman to uphold the law, not to help a rich man bend it to his will." Wade took the book, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What is this?" "It is the private ledger from the Territorial Surveyor's Office, the one that handled the original claims in this valley. The official one on file at the courthouse is a clean copy. This is the real one. Look at the entry for the Willow Creek survey." Wade opened the book under the light from the porch lantern. He found the page, and there it was, a notation in the margin next to the Callahan claim, a note about a potential ambiguity in the eastern boundary marker, and below it, another entry, dated a month later, a payment of $200 to the surveyor, from one Silas Dryden, the final, official survey, the one on file, had been altered. The ambiguity erased in a way that would create the very loophole Dryden was now exploiting. "Dryden paid him off," Finch said. "Years ago, he was planning this even then, waiting for the right time, for the railroad to be close enough to make the water worth a fortune. This book proves it. It proves fraud." "Why are you doing this?" Wade asked, his voice softer now. "It is a big risk." Finch looked toward the house, where a warm, yellow light glowed in the kitchen window. "I saw what happened in town," he said. "I saw you stand up for that woman and her children. I have got a family of my own. A man has to be able to look at himself in the mirror. I figure it is time I chose which side of the mirror I want to be on." He nodded curtly, swung himself back onto his horse, and disappeared into the night, leaving Wade standing in the cold, holding the proof that could save his ranch, a gift from the conscience of a single, decent man. When he came back inside, The weight of the night's events was heavy on him. Lydia was waiting for him in the kitchen, a fresh pot of coffee on the stove. She looked at his face and knew something momentous had happened. He laid the ledger on the table and explained what it was. As she looked at the faded ink, the undeniable proof of Dryden's long-planned treachery, a single tear of relief traced a path through the weariness on her face. They sat in silence for a long time. The ticking of the clock, the only sound. The legal battle was not over, but for the first time, they had a real weapon, a fighting chance. Wade looked at her, at the quiet strength that had become the anchor of his world. He thought of the fire, the blizzard, the punch thrown in the street. He thought of Sam's adoring eyes and the sound of Junie's humming. The lonely, silent fortress he had built for himself had been invaded, and he had never felt more alive. "Lydia," he said, his voice rough. She looked up, her eyes meeting his across the table. "This is not going to be an easy life. Dryden will not give up. The railroad will come. There will be other fights. There will be droughts and blizzards and sick cattle. There will be days we are so tired we can barely stand." "I know," she said softly. He stood up and walked around the table to stand beside her. He took her hand, the one he had bandaged, and held it in both of his. "I am not a man for fancy words. I cannot promise you flowers or poetry. All I can promise you is that I will stand with you through all of it. I will work beside you. I will fight for you. And I will share the burden of it, every last bit." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a letter from his lawyer. "I had him draw this up today," he said, his voice low and steady. "It is a new deed for the Callahan Range. Tomorrow, I'm going to sign it. It will have my name on it, and it will have yours, Lydia Carr Callahan, and Samuel Carr Callahan, and June Carr Callahan. This land, this house, it will belong to all of us. Not because you are my housekeeper, but because you are my partner." He looked down at her, his gray eyes stripped of all their defenses, his heart laid bare. "Lydia, will you marry me?" Tears were now streaming freely down her face, but they were not tears of sadness or relief. They were tears of a profound, quiet joy. She had come to this place seeking a refuge and had found a home. She had asked for a job and had been offered a life. She looked up at this hard, difficult, honorable man, and she saw her future. It would not be easy, but it would be real, and it would be shared. She stood up and put her arms around his neck, pressing her face against the rough wool of his shirt. "Yes," she whispered, "for the safety, for the justice, and for a love I never thought I would find again. Yes, Wade." The journey to the county seat was a cold, clear affair. The new deed signed and witnessed by Bill Hart was tucked safely in Wade's inside pocket, a silent promise of the future. The surveyor's ledger was in his lawyer's bag, a testament to the past's treachery. They rode in the big sleigh, a united front against the legal storm they were about to face. Lydia sat beside Wade, her hand resting calmly on his arm, a silent source of strength. In the back, Sam and Junie were quiet, sensing the gravity of the day. The courtroom was a large, drafty room that smelled of stale cigar smoke and damp wool. Silas Dryden was already there, flanked by his slick city lawyer. He looked confident, almost bored, as if this were a mere formality before he took possession of his prize. He gave Wade and Lydia a look of supreme disdain, a look that dismissed them as insignificant obstacles. The circuit judge was an old man with eyes that had seen everything, from petty squabbles to capital crimes. He listened patiently as Dryden's lawyer laid out his case, presenting the official altered survey maps and speaking of legal precedent and property rights. It sounded impressive, airtight. Lydia felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach, despite the evidence they held. Then it was their turn. Their lawyer, a quiet, methodical man from town, did not begin with arguments. He simply called Deputy Finch to the stand. Finch was nervous, but his voice was steady as he described the existence of the second ledger and how he had come to give it to Wade Callahan. Then the lawyer presented the ledger itself to the judge. The courtroom went silent as the judge put on his spectacles and examined the old book, his finger tracing the faded lines of ink, the damning entry of payment from Dryden to the surveyor. A muscle began to work in Dryden's jaw. The lawyer was not finished. He called Tom Dawson to the stand. Tom, clutching his own set of account books, testified to a pattern of financial pressure Dryden had exerted on the local sheriff over the years, a series of loans that were never quite paid back, creating a web of obligation. Then Bill Hart and Pete Sawyer testified. They spoke of the hayfire, of Dryden's open threats, of the fear he had sown in the valley, and of the community watch they had formed in response. They were not just witnesses. They were the voice of a community pushed too far. When the lawyer finally rested his case, the judge took off his spectacles and polished them slowly. He looked at Silas Dryden for a long, silent moment, his gaze filled with a cold, clear contempt. He then announced his ruling. His voice filled the room, each word a hammer blow to Dryden's arrogance. He declared that Dryden's suit was not only dismissed, it was a clear case of fraudulent litigation based on tampered documents. He ordered a full investigation into the matter of the territorial surveys, into the financial dealings of the sheriff's office, and into the suspicious fire at the Callahan Ranch. Silas Dryden's face went from red to a sickly, mottled white. He started to rise, to sputter a protest, but the judge's gavel came down with a crack that echoed like a rifle shot. Dryden was ruined. His power, built on fear and deceit, had been dismantled in a public forum by the truth, a stolen ledger, and the courage of ordinary men. As they left the courthouse, no one would meet Dryden's eye. His reign over the valley was over. The ride home was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the easy silence of a battle won, of a burden lifted. The future was their own again, secured not just by a legal ruling, but by the bonds they had forged with their neighbors. Winter, however, was a foe that could not be taken to court. A month later, it unleashed its full fury in a storm that made the last blizzard seem like a passing squall. The snow came down, not in flakes, but in a solid, blinding sheet, driven by a wind that screamed like a banshee. For 2 days, they were prisoners in the house, the world outside a raging chaos of white. On the third morning, the wind died down, but the snow was still falling thick and heavy. A quick count of the herd in the main corral revealed a problem. One of the new heifers, a young first-time mother, was missing. She had been close to calving. "She will have sought shelter to have her calf," Wade said, his face grim as he stared into the white curtain of snow. "But she could be anywhere. In this, she and the newborn will not last the day." A section of the barn roof was groaning under the immense weight of the snow, and Wade knew he had to shore it up before it collapsed on the rest of the herd. He could not go himself. He looked at Sam. The boy had grown in the past months, his shoulders broadening, a new maturity in his eyes. He stood taller, no longer a boy playing at being a man, but a young man ready for responsibility. Wade put a heavy hand on his son's shoulder. "You know what to look for," he said, his voice low and serious. "I have taught you. Think like a cow, not a man. Where would you go to escape the wind? Where would you feel safe?" Sam's face was pale, but he nodded, his expression serious. "The draws along the creek bed, or the old line shack in the south pasture." Wade nodded, a look of fierce pride in his eyes. He called over 2 of the younger ranch hands. "You go with him," he told them, "and you listen to him. He is the boss on this." It was the ultimate expression of trust, a passing of the mantle. Sam pulled his hat down low, his jaw set with a determination that mirrored Wade's own. He led his small team out into the storm, disappearing into the swirling snow. Lydia watched from the window, her heart in her throat. She trusted Wade's judgment, but Sam was still her little boy. She spent the next hours in a state of quiet dread, keeping herself busy, but her ears were constantly strained for any sound from the outside. Out in the storm, Sam felt a fear colder than the wind, but Wade's lessons were a steady voice in his head. He remembered riding with Wade, the man pointing out how the snow drifted, how the animals used the contours of the land for protection. He led his men methodically, checking the sheltered spots one by one. The cold was brutal, and the snow was so deep it was exhausting to walk through. After 2 hours of fruitless searching, the ranch hands were starting to look doubtful. Sam stopped, closing his eyes for a moment, shutting out the wind and the white, trying to think. He remembered one specific lesson. Wade had told him that a mother's instinct was the most powerful thing in nature. She would not just seek shelter, she would seek a place that felt like a fortress. There was one spot they had not checked, a deep, narrow ravine, half hidden by a stand of old, thick pines, a place almost like a cave. They found her there. The heifer was exhausted, but she was alive, and curled beside her, steaming in the frigid air, was a tiny, newborn calf, struggling to stand on its wobbly legs. Getting them back was the real test. The calf was too weak to walk far in the deep snow. Without hesitation, Sam took off his own thick sheepskin coat and wrapped the small animal in it. He and the two hands then took turns carrying the calf, a heavy, precious burden, while they coaxed the weary mother along behind them. The journey back was a long, slow procession of raw survival, a small team against the vast, indifferent power of the winter. When they finally stumbled into the warmth and light of the barn, they were near collapse, their faces covered in ice, their bodies aching with cold. Wade was there. He took one look at the shivering calf, the exhausted men, and at Sam, who stood swaying with fatigue but with his head held high. He did not say much. He just walked over and clasped Sam's shoulder, a firm, proud grip that said more than any words could, "You did good, son. You did real good." That night, the storm still raged outside, but inside the ranch house kitchen, it was a world away. A fire roared in the hearth, and the air was filled with the rich smell of beef stew. They sat around the table, the four of them, safe and warm and together. The events of the day were retold. Sam's story, the main feature, he told it with a newfound confidence, the words of a boy who had been tested and had not been found wanting. Junie, who had been listening with wide-eyed fascination, looked across the table at Wade. He was watching Sam with a quiet, contented smile on his face, a look of pure, unguarded pride. She saw him not as the rich rancher, or as her mother's new husband, but as the center of their new world, the man who rode through the night to save her, the man who had sent her brother out to be a hero. It all seemed so simple and right to her. "Papa," she said, her small voice clear and natural in the warm room, "can I have more stew?" The conversation stopped. Sam looked at his sister, then at Wade. Lydia's breath caught in her throat, a beautiful, painful catch of emotion. Wade turned his head slowly to look at the little girl. The title, which had sounded so strange and jarring from Sam in a moment of crisis, now sounded as natural as breathing. A slow warmth spread through his chest, melting the last, stubborn remnants of ice around his heart. He looked at Junie, then at Sam, then at Lydia, her eyes shining in the lamplight. This was his family. This was his home. The wind howled outside, a lonely, desolate sound. But inside, no one heard it. All they could hear was the happy clatter of a spoon against a bowl as Wade smiled and answered, "Of course you can." The winter did not surrender its grip easily. It clung to the valley with a stubborn, frozen tenacity, releasing its hold one slow, dripping icicle at a time. But spring, when it finally came, arrived with the force of a revolution. The first sign was the sound, a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth. It was the sound of ice breaking on Willow Creek. The water, freed from its long imprisonment, began to rise, swelling over its banks. a turbulent, muddy, and profoundly beautiful symbol of life's relentless push forward. The land, which had been a stark canvas of white and gray, began to blush with the pale green of new grass. Wade and Lydia stood on the porch, watching the creek churn, a force of nature that had once been the focus of a legal war and was now simply a promise of renewal. The air smelled of damp earth and possibility. They had filed the papers and signed the new deed at the county seat a week earlier, their union a matter of legal fact. But the law was a cold, dry thing. What they wanted was a promise made not to a judge, but to each other, witnessed by the land and the people who had become their family. Their wedding day was warm, blessed by a high, benevolent sun. The porch of the ranch house served as their altar, the newly painted railings draped with long, trailing vines Lydia and Junie had gathered. Bouquets of wild crocus and buttercups, the first flowers of spring, sat in mason jars on every flat surface, their bright, simple colors a testament to nature's quiet artistry. There was no organ music, only the cheerful, rhythmic strumming of a guitar played by one of Pete Sawyer's ranch hands. Their guests were the people who had stood with them in the fire and in the fight. Bill Hart and his wife were there, along with the Sawyers. Tom and Mae Dawson had closed the mercantile for the afternoon to attend, their faces beaming. Nora Bell, the schoolteacher, looked on with a gentle, happy smile. Even Deputy Finch had come with his family, his presence a quiet symbol of his own redemption. Lydia wore her best dress, a simple blue calico she had painstakingly mended and pressed. It was not a traditional wedding gown, but on her, it looked more beautiful than any silk or lace. In her hair, she wore a crown of small white flowers that Junie had woven for her that morning. She stood beside Wade, her hand tucked firmly in the crook of his arm, her face serene. Wade looked uncomfortable but resolute in a clean shirt and his best trousers. He was not a man for ceremonies, but he stood tall and proud. Sam stood beside him, his hair slicked down with water, his young face a solemn and perfect reflection of Wade's own. The circuit judge who had presided over their legal victory had agreed to officiate, his presence lending a satisfying sense of poetic justice to the occasion. The judge kept his words brief and direct, which suited everyone. He spoke of partnership, of building a life on the hard ground of mutual respect and shared labor. When it came time for the vows, Wade and Lydia did not exchange flowery promises. They looked at each other, their hands joined, and spoke simple truths. He pledged to be her partner, to honor her strength, and to protect their family and their home with every last breath in his body. She pledged to stand beside him, to share the burdens and the joys, and to make the house a home filled with warmth and laughter. It was a contract of the heart, as solid and real as the mountains that frame the horizon. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, a cheer went up from their friends. Wade, in a rare public display of affection, leaned down and kissed his bride. A long, tender kiss that spoke of blizzards weathered and a quiet harbor found. The celebration that followed was not a grand reception, but a community picnic on the sprawling lawn in front of the house. Tables were laden with roasted beef, potato salad, fresh-baked bread, and Mae Dawson's famous apple pies. The music was lively, the conversation loud, and the laughter was constant. It was the valley breathing a collective sigh of relief, celebrating a victory that belonged to all of them. Later in the afternoon, as the party continued, Wade stood with Bill Hart near the corral, watching the children play a chaotic game of tag. Bill took a long draw from his pipe, his expression thoughtful. "Heard some news in town yesterday," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Silas Dryden is gone for good. Sold his holdings to a syndicate from back east for a fraction of what they are worth. He left on the morning stage, and I do not think anyone was sad to see him go." Wade nodded, a quiet satisfaction settling in his chest. It was the final closing of a painful chapter. "That is not all," Bill continued. blowing a smoke ring into the clear air. The survey crews for the railroad were spotted coming over the Absaroka Pass. It seems your troubles with the lawyers might be over, but the whole valley is going to have to reckon with progress. And progress always brings a new set of troubles. Wade looked out over his land, at the greening pastures and the clear, flowing water of the creek. He saw Lieti across the lawn, laughing at something Nora Bell had said. He saw Sam, showing one of the Sawyer boys how to properly skip a stone. He saw Junie, her flower crown askew, chasing a butterfly. The news of the railroad, which once would have filled him with a cold dread, now felt different. It was a challenge, yes, but it was no longer a threat to be faced alone. He and Lydia had built something here, something more than a ranch. They had built a family, and with their community standing beside them, they had reforged a valley. They would face the future, whatever it brought, together. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and lavender, the guests began to depart, their wagons rattling down the lane, their voices calling out final goodbyes. The house grew quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was a peaceful, contented silence, filled with the echoes of laughter and the promise of a shared life. Wade and Lydia stood on the porch, the same porch where they had made their vows, and watched the last light fade from the sky. The children were inside, already falling asleep, worn out from the excitement of the day. A gentle breeze stirred, carrying the sweet scent of pine and damp earth. "It is so quiet," Lydia murmured, leaning her head against his shoulder. Wade put his arm around her, holding her close. "It used to be a lonely sound," he said, his voice rough with emotion. The quiet. It was the loudest thing in the house. And now she asked, "Now, it is just peaceful. You and the children, you filled this place up. Lydia, you filled up all the empty spaces I did not even know I had." He had learned that solitude was an armor that kept out as much warmth as it did pain. True strength was not found in standing alone, but in having a hand to hold when the storms came. It was a choice you had to make, every single day, to reach for that hand. Lydia smiled, a soft, private smile in the gathering dark. The house was not empty. She said, "It was just waiting. We were all just waiting to come home." They stood there for a long time, watching the first stars appear in the vast Montana sky. Two people who had found each other in a lonely land. Their love a quiet, steady flame against the coming night, a promise of all the sunrises yet to come. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please remember to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.